Welcome to session 3 of Middle High German. Over to Nikolaus Ruge.
Off we go. Classical Middle High German, 1170 to 1250. To avoid a possible misunderstanding, the 1170s did not mark a turning point in the history of German language and literature. For a start, this applies to the way in which material was transmitted. Interest in the type of text discussed in the last session was by no means waning, nor did the text that will be discussed shortly enter the transmission history in a completely unexpected and unintended way. Religious literature continued to be copied, while around the middle of the 12th century the first stanzas of Minnesang appeared in the southeast of the German-speaking area. There was not even a systematic change in language around 1170 that would justify a division in the internal language history. Nevertheless, certain changes in the systematic possibilities of the language can be observed, for example in the area of rhyming language. Around 1170, when the Middle High German Rolandslied by the priest Konrad was being written, impure rhymes like dicke, blicken, and identical rhymes, Augin, Augin, were apparently still permissible, but in the reworking of the text by Stricker around 1220, apparently only pure rhymes were permissible. This observation offers a first indication that the change that took place in a part of the German text tradition in the 1170s was one of formal and stylistic ideals. Some contemporaries viewed this change positively. A famous passage from the so-called literary excursus in Gottfried's Tristan, written around 1210, is particularly significant in this regard. In this passage, Gottfried praises his fellow epic writer, Hartmann von Auer. Hartmann, der au wäre, ahi, wie der Dümere beide Usen und Innen mit Worten und mit Sinnen durchfärvet und durchzieret, wie mit Redde figieret der Aventüre meine, wie Luther und wie Reine sine kristallinen Worte dienen, beidü sind und jemmer müssen sie. Gottfried proves to be a connoisseur of ancient school rhetoric, the Latin terminology of which he renders in German, the first attempt of this kind since Notker of St. Gall. Thus, the formulation Hartmann Dümere durchfärvet embellishes his story, refers to the decorative of antiquity, colores rhetorici. The binomial pair mit Worten und mit Sinnen also reflects this distinction, familiar from ancient rhetoric, between figura verborum, processes of external embellishment relating to the linguistic surface, and figurae sententiarum, procedures for shaping the content. When Hartmann's crystallinen Wortelin is mentioned, we can discern the classic stylistic ideal of perspicuitas, transparency. When it is said immediately afterwards that these Luther und Reine beidü sind und jemmer müssen sie, Gottfried speaks of the timeless aesthetic value that Hartmann's poetry deserves. In this respect, shortly after 1200, there was indeed an awareness of the timeless quality of literary idiolects that was comparable to ancient models. If, based on such isolated evidence, however, the entire period between 1170 and 1250 is described in literary historiography as Dorfian classicism or courtly classicism, and then the corresponding language period as classical Middle High German, this reveals more about the anachronistic endeavors of 19th century philology to measure medieval language and literature by the yardstick of Goethe or Schiller. The epochal designation Dorfian Classic is only justified insofar as there is a period in which the tradition of classical Middle High German overlaps with a section of the Stoffer period of rule. Only very few of the Stoffers were known to be patrons of vernacular literature, the likeliest being the final ruler, King Conrad IV. They are much better informed about the literary engagement of other ruling families. But that brings us to a crucial point. The tradition, which complemented the existing text types from 1170, is no longer aimed at clerics or lay people in the monastic milieu, but is oriented towards the specific communicative needs of new, namely courtly, audience. At the same time, it is clear that the texts of courtly literature, which were created in 1170 or later, should not be equated with Middle High German per se, which, as is well known, was not a homogeneous concept. A proven linguistic approach to describing such a constellation is the language variety model. Language varieties are social, regional, functional, or other forms of language. Language varieties are by no means strictly separated from each other. A single speaker can rather use different sociolects depending on the communicative situation. The sociolect is the language of a more or less clearly defined social group, such as youth language. The sociolect is usually characterized by specific vocabulary and specific phraseology. They are normally used for internal group communication. By idiolect, we mean the language of an individual. Dialect is a regionally valid language variety. Technical languages are varieties that serve to communicate between members of a specific professional group, such as computer language or legal language. Finally, functiolect refers to a use of language that is geared to a respective communicative situation. Word choice, word formation, and sentence structure are primarily determined by the function of the respective speech act. At first glance, it may come as a surprise if the language of the courtly classic is also regarded as a functiolect, as is done by many researchers, notably by Norbert Richard Wolff. The most important reason is that for an analysis as a sociolect, the underlying social group would have to be clearly identifiable. However, this is not the case, as can be seen from a well-known text example. The fact that textual transmission occurs outside the monastic clerical milieu and gains a foothold in the traditionally literate sphere of secular courts is apparently so unusual at the turn of the 12th and 13th century that it is repeatedly made explicit. The prologue to Hartmann's Der arme Heinrich emphasizes that the following text was written by ein Ritter, a knight, who so gelehret was, dass an den Buchen las, was daran geschrieben fand, who also learned that he was able to understand whatever he found written in books, namely a certain Hartmann, a dienestman, i.e. originally a member of the lower nobility. One can only speculate as to whether the circumstance favored a knight doing what was incompatible with military service, namely to acquire literary material through reading and to transform it into new text in the form of writing. It should be clear, however, that the juxtaposition of the status designations Ritter and Dienestmann makes the social positioning of the text and thus its assignment to a sociolect more difficult. Similar problems arise when looking more closely at the attribute höfisch, courtly, or its Middle High German predecessors höfisch, hübsch, etc. The literature usually states that this is a loan translation from Old French courtois. It does not quite fit that the first German document of the term comes from the Kaiserchronik, i.e. a text that draws on Latin, not Old French sources, and whose origin is assumed to be Regensburg, which is not exactly near the Germanic Romance language border. In addition, one should not forget that the term höfisch has two meanings, as can be illustrated by a passage from Der Welsche Gast by Thomasin von Circlere, a text which taught etiquette for young nobles from around 1215. Höflich, courteously, very descriptively designates both what belongs to the court and takes place zu Hove, at court, as well as normatively describes an ethical and aesthetic ideal to which the court society has committed itself and to which its members have to orientate themselves. The functional diastratic structure partially overlaps with the diatopic structure of the German-speaking area. Firstly, in the 1170s, a Limburg, Rhineland, Central German poetic language developed, mainly associated with the name Heinrich von Feldeke, before the courtly poetic language which was mainly influenced by West Upper German, subsequently developed prestige. What is remarkable, however, is that despite all this anchoring in Schreibsprachen, written dialects, efforts towards supra-regional functionality of the language forms can be recognized. The most common explanation for this is that in order to secure their livelihood, the poets depended on their text being able to be received in as large a territory as possible. Since the tradition of the German language courtly literature is almost exclusively written in rhyming couplets or stanzas that also end in rhyme, a central challenge for the poets is an appropriate design of the verse closures. Heinrich von Veldeke, who came from Maastricht, conceived his rhymes in such a way that they functioned independently of the occurrence of the Tenuis und Medienverschiebungen, voiceless and voiced shifts of the second consonant shift, which I would like to briefly illustrate with a few verses of his Aeneas roman. The German voiceless dental plosive t is shifted to the dental double fricative s as part of the Tenuisverschiebung. We will come back to this later in more detail, whereby the latter is simplified to s after a long vowel diphthong or when in final position. Veldeke's native dialect, Limburgisch, did not make the shift and conserves the Germanic t. The High German vergaß, saß, and saßen, aßen also work in Limburgisch, where they are vergatt, satt, and saten, aten. The Germanic voiced labial fricative v becomes a voiced labial fricative as part of the Medienverschiebung. Depending on the linguistic landscape, this results in such rhyming couplets as leben, geben, or leven, geven. Veldeke's strategy only fails when the coda of the rhyming words deviates phonetically. The final f in brief does not represent the Germanic fricative because Middle High German brief is borrowed from Latin breve, short letter, and accordingly only rhymes with Limburgisch lief, not with High German lieb. A comparable example of the geographical distribution of lexemes can be seen in the variants of the verbs gehen and stehen. Double forms have existed here since Germanic. The Old High German and Middle High German doublets are either gan, stan, or gehen, stehen. Their distribution is geographically determined. The R forms apply to Alemannic, Rhenish Franconian, and Low German, the E forms to Bavarian and Central German, with the exception of the aforementioned Rhenish Franconian. Authors from the E areas, such as the Central German Heinrich von Morungen, but also the probably Bavarian poet of the Nibelungenlied, actually use the R forms in their poetry, contrary to their native usage, not always, but frequently. The tendency towards a supra-regional balance is also reflected in the fact that authors who can be assigned to a specific dialect area avoid regionally valid vocabulary and instead use lexemes that are foreign to their dialect of origin. For example, Bavarian authors use Albert instead of einfaltig, Flachs instead of Ha, Halde, mountain slope instead of Liete, Knabbe instead of Burbe, Kleben instead of Picken, Os for Ross, etc., and thus orientate themselves towards the language of Wolfram or Hartmann, which is perceived as exemplary. The lexis of the courtly literature language shows a completely different kind of supra-regional character in that it demonstrates a brand new openness to French loanwords and foreign words. This linguistic import is just one aspect of a comprehensive cultural transfer that took place from France to Germany in the 12th and 13th centuries, which encompassed all areas of courtly culture: ornaments, clothing, music, luxury goods, literature. This exchange was facilitated by political and personal contacts among members of the German and French nobility, which in many cases had an indirect impact on Franco-German literary relations. Mathilde of England, daughter of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, asked her husband Henry the Lion to have the old French Chanson de Roland composed in German. Intensive connubial relationships prevailed between the French high nobility and the noble house of the Zähringer in southwest Germany. In all probability, the clients for Hartmann's Arthurian epics likely came from the ranks of this house. The extent to which such contexts are reflected in the French language skills of the German aristocracy remains a matter of debate. The chronicler Ottokar from the Gaul reports as follows on the misfortunes of Duke Rudolf III of Austria, who had traveled to Paris in 1300 to marry the daughter of the late King Philip III. Nicht mocht verstande keines ihrer Wort. He couldn't understand anything she said, in die österreichische Reimchronik. An episode from the epic Perte au Grand Pied by the northern Frenchman Adné Leroy from the second half of the 13th century is also often quoted. Tout droit à celui temps que je si vous devisse avoir une costume en étroit pays, que tous les grands seigneurs, les comtes et les marchis, avoir entouré Jean-Françoise Toudis pour apprendre François, leurs filles et leurs fils. At least for the period from 1170 to 1250, no evidence of this practice, which is said to have been widespread in the German high nobility, can be found. Actual evidence of the presence of French at medieval German princely courts is often limited to reports of reading aloud from French books. In a well-known passage from Hartmann's Ewine, the titular hero meets the family of the Lord of Castle Maladventure. The Lord's daughter catches Ewine's eye. Und vor in beiden saß ein Magd, du ist wohl, ist mir gesagt, welch Lesenkunde, du kurzte in die Stunde. Two aspects of this passage are of particular interest. On the one hand, this shows once again that, in the course of the history of the German language and its literature, women are the driving forces of cultural innovations within the courtly sphere. On the one hand, the functional change in courtly tradition compared to the rigid text types in early Middle High German is once again explicitly clear here. It's about entertainment, not about edification. Finally, individual courtly epic poets also commented on their own knowledge of French. The narrator of Wilhelm, who we can probably identify as Wolfram, expresses himself as follows. Herbergen ist Logieren genannt. So viel han ich der Sprache erkannt. Ein ungefüger Champanais, kund viel Bass Franzais, da nicht wie ich Franzos spreche. While older scholars read the passage either as a topos of modesty or as an ironic admission of a lack of knowledge of French, there is some evidence that an expression of a special poetic self-confidence is more likely what is being stated here, as Wolfram uses the Champagne dialect for metric for comparison, as it was considered by contemporaries to be the best form of French. In the session on Middle High German word formation, we will try to contrast Wolfram's comments about himself with his actual use of the language. Let us now move on from the discussion of metalinguistic testimonies back to the object language perspective and switch our focus from producer to recipient. It can be assumed with some certainty that the German courtly public, without at least passive knowledge of French, would have found it difficult to appreciate passages like that which follows, which is teeming with French formulae and calque. We will also come back to the latter and respectively to verbs with the iren suffix in the session on word formation. Marke sagt Tristanden an. Freund, sprach er, heißest du Tristan? Ja, Herr, Tristan, Deosal. Deosal, Beaus Vassal. Merci, sprach er, gentil Roi. Edler König Krone Valois, ihr und Übergesinde, ihr seht von Gottes Kinde jämmer gebenediert. Do ward gemerziert, Wunder von der Hoffe diet. Sie tribben nivern das eine Lied. Tristan, Tristan, li parmenoir, come bea, cum courtois. In the second half of the 13th century, the French influence on the vocabulary of German courtly literature seems to have increasingly become the butt of ridicule. The following stanza, which has survived under the name of Tannhäuser, certainly does not depict a courtly functiolect, no matter how Romanesque, but rather parodies it. Ich hort da wollt chantieren, die Nachtigall taubieren, allda musst ich parlieren, zur Rechte wie mir wäre. Ich war's an, alles wäre ein Riviere, ich da gesagt. Durch den Forest ging ein Bach, zur Tal über ein Planüre. Ich schleich ihr nach und sich sie fand, die schönen Kreatüre. Wie dem Fontane saß die klare Süße von Fettüre. Apart from the acceleration purposes, the function of the vocabulary throughout the Tannhäuser stanza is questionable. For central concepts such as sing, forest, and meadow, of course, there were common lexemes in Middle High German, singen, Wald, and Auve. So why replace them with loans? In many other cases, however, French loanwords in courtly language corresponded to the expressive needs that hereditary Germanic vocabulary could not meet. From the large number of examples, I would like to pick out just one that is prominent in literary history, namely the noun Aventure. Aventure means more than risk, event, telling of something. Rather, the expression designates the specific constellation in which the protagonists of the Arthurian romance find themselves. In response to the question from the forestman in Hartmann's Ewine, Aventure, was ist das? Kalorient replies that the packaged concept conveys, dass ich suchende Ritte einen Mann, der mit mir stritte, der gewaffen sie als ich. I write searching for a man to fight with me as armed as I am, and subsequently describes this procedure as a Waage. Within the courtly functiolect, Aventure thus denotes the ride into the unknown in search of an equal opponent. Contexts like the dialogue between Kalorient and the forestman are particularly meaningful for historical lexicography because the source itself provides very precise information on a specific use of Middle High German Aventure. Such examples are referred to as self-explanatory testaments, sprechende Belege in lexicography. However, if one now compares the reproduction of the text passage in two different manuscripts of Hartmann's Ewine, you'll find the two on an extra sheet for better readability. It turns out that the question from the first man about the meaning of Aventure and the corresponding answer by Kalorient are not attested everywhere. The manuscript from Gießen University Library 97, which dates to the second quarter of the 13th century, contains the complete section, while this central dialogue element is missing in the contemporaneous manuscript Heidelberg CPG 397. A precise comparison of the two manuscripts shows that such differences in content are by no means the only way they differ. In addition to such variations in content, there are also linguistic differences on many levels which are even more prominent. We'll start with orthography. While the Gießen manuscript uses the letter V both for the velar fricative Z and for the vowel U, CPG 397 writes the vowel almost exclusively with U, the letter. Word separation by spaces is fully developed in the Gießen manuscript, while pronouns in CPG 397 are not yet consistently separated by spaces. Als ich instead of als ich, ihr sleter instead of ihr slet, space he. That's Central German. Phonology. In CPG 397, certain word formations exhibit low German phonological features, Sulke shows an unshifted velar stop at post-liquid position, while in Selche, Gießen 97, the operation of the tenuous Verschiebung has resulted in a velar fricative. Morphology. While CPG 397 shows the Middle Low German pronominal forms de, em, the Gießen manuscript had the more southern variants der and im. The variation of wird Gießen versus werde, CPG 397, also shows differences at the morphological level, as it reflects contrasts in the implementation of the tense stems and the strong verb inflection. Werde has already gone through the unification of the root vowel in the present tense to e. The Gießen manuscript, on the other hand, still shows the old upload pattern. And finally, syntax. Syntactic variation is evident in sentence negation, which is known to be expressed discontinuously in Middle High German through the combination of a clitic and a negator. However, this process only happens in 3PG 397, das ne fürstige mir nicht. There is no clitic in the Gießen manuscript. The common feature shared between all the variants mentioned so far is that they are regular and functional. Regardless of whether the root vowel is I or E, the forms wird and werde are recognizable as the first-person singular present indicative of werden. Sentence negation works regardless of whether it occurs in one or two parts. Such regular variants differ from erroneous variants which are not functional. While the Gießen manuscript uses the antinomy-based double formula verre oder bi, literally near or far, which means somewhere, CPG 397 replaces the first term verre, far, with nah, near, and thus neutralizes the antonym relation that forms the basis of the formula. The resultant nah oder bi, nearby or nearby, is quite illogical and therefore irregular. Correspondingly, the expression nah oder bi can only be found once in the entirety of Middle High German tradition, which is here. This is also a clear indication of its irregularity. It becomes problematic when handwritten variants are not recorded as errors because they are illogical, dysfunctional, and unique, but because they deviate from the normalized language form of the Middle High German text editions. What does this mean? Does this mean? The so-called normal Middle High German is not a pure fiction, but is based on the language of a few text witnesses considered to be particularly close to the author. One of them is the Gießen Ivan manuscript 97. If one now compares this version of the dialogue between Kaluriant and the Forestman with the text of the critical edition by Ludwig Wolf, only superficial deviations become apparent, mostly in the orthography. The edition does not differentiate between long and short S letters. It resolves abbreviations such as to und tacitly, and it introduces contemporary punctuation rules as well as the marking of long vowels with circumflexes. From a literary, historical, and/or didactic point of view, there are good reasons for such interventions. From a linguistic point of view, however, it is important to avoid two fallacies. First, confusing handwritten tradition with editorial intervention. It would be absurd to examine the punctuation in Hartmann's Ivan on the basis of the editorial text, which in this instance followed the orthographic norm of the 20th century. The basis of an examination of punctuation in the 13th century would have to be the punctuation system of the Gießen manuscript, which differs fundamentally from the modern language. Second, interpreting the variants of bad manuscripts as mistakes. The fact that Wolf's edition is based on the linguistic form of the Gießen manuscript, apart from small graphic details and from the rather astonishing fact that it rejects the correct reading verre oder bi, is due to its supposed quality. For 19th century edition philology, the quality of the textual witness is measured by its proximity to the original. At first glance, this seems logical, since one can assume that the version for which the author is responsible, the original, most reliably represents the language level originally intended. We have already seen that the handwritten tradition takes place through copying. Every time a text is copied, it diverges linguistically from the original version, both in terms of time and space. This also explains why the Gießen manuscript is considered to be closer to the author than CPG 397. Hartmann von Auer was probably active between 1180 and 1210 in the southwestern German-speaking area. Ivan is dated to around 1200. In terms of time, both manuscripts are about the same distance away from the original, about 15 to 30 years. Spatially, however, the distance between the Middle Low German CPG 397 and the written dialect of Hartmann's presumed region of origin is significantly greater than in the case of the East Upper German Gießen manuscript. From the point of view of literary history, it is likely that the latter represents Hartmann's original better. However, it would be a mistake to conclude from the relative distance to the original that the textual witness was incorrect in terms of language. You need to accept the limitations of trying to measure all text witnesses of Hartmann's Ivan by the yardstick of a lost original. If, on the other hand, CPG 397 is viewed as linguistic evidence of the Central Low German funcdialect of the second quarter of the 13th century, the manuscript then represents a fully fledged source for the history of the language of its own accord. On the basis of these observations, a contrastive sociolinguistic analysis of normal Middle High German would have to ask why the edited texts are less tolerant of the violation of single and supra-single language rules and conventions that the handwritten tradition is. The explanation for the deviations lies in the historical and linguistic context of the text editions. These all come from the 19th to 21st centuries, i.e. a time when German had achieved the status of a standard language. A standard language is, as you will remember from the first session, a privileged variety that has binding linguistic norms in both the written and the spoken language and institutions to enforce them. Before a language can become a standard language, it usually has to have reached the level of development of a written language, Schriftsprache. In contrast to standard languages, written languages only have a number of binding linguistic norms and institutions in the area of written language. Middle High German was a language that was neither uniformly written nor spoken, but consisted of various Schreibsprachen with different spatial and functional validities. The differences between the Middle High German of the text editions and the Middle High German of the manuscripts can be explained by the interplay of two linguistic and sociological factors. Firstly, modern users of the editions approach them with expectations shaped by their understanding of standard language. Secondly, the pre-modern user's approach is shaped by Schreibsprachen. The main difference between these two expectations is the tolerance of text producers and recipients towards linguistic variance, which, conversely, does not mean that modern writing knows no deviations and medieval writing is completely irregular. After looking at the spectrum of variation tolerance using the example of the Ivan passage, we now need to ask which instances of linguistic regularity can be proven for the transmission of classical Middle High German or its period. Since the beginning of the 13th century, there have been shifts in the area of written institutions and their agents, for example, from the monastic scriptorium to the city clerk's office and from the clergy to the layman. However, the central link between the vernacular and the overarching Latin written culture remains untouched. The writers of vernacular texts continue to learn their trade from Latin and thus participate in the tradition of linguistic standardization. Because of its orality, we know next to nothing about its specific impact on writing lessons. A very general reflex of linguistic regularity is formed solely by statements of text producers who worry about harmful interventions by the recipient, from which it can be concluded that they evaluate linguistic invariance positively. One vernacular example among others would be the epilogue to Konrad von Fußenbrunn's Childhood of Jesus, where in manuscript B, written around 1300, anyone who es bas oder anders spricht und setzet synü spell dazu is warned against jeopardizing his reputation. Wann entehrt selbe sich. Of course, such metalinguistic and pragmatic utterances are not found in a vacuum, but are reflected in the tradition by the fact that complex correction procedures can often be detected even in less magnificently designed Middle High German manuscripts, such as the Munich Parsifal Codex I. For clarification, let's take a look at the corrections that the so-called text hand, the scribe of the manuscript itself, made during or immediately after the end of the writing process. How did he go about it? The first and most profound correction must have been made during the copying process, immediately after entering wann der scribe should have noticed that he had gone a line too high in the template, which would have led to a repetition of the pronominal subject er. So he crossed out the passage he had mistakenly recopied and entered the correct one on the new line. The other two corrections relate more to smaller orthographic matters and were probably carried out in the course of fine-tuning the script at the end of the working day or after the end of the copying process. Beyond detailed observations, this and countless comparable cases illustrate the unsurprising finding that vernacular writing in the 13th century was the subject of linguistic regularization on several levels. In the more recent discussion of medieval research, however, the focus was less on the regularity and invariance of the vernacular tradition and more on its variance. Medieval writing does not produce variance, it is variance, is the often quoted dictum of the French linguist Bernard Cerchilini. In fact, what has just been said should be remembered. Despite corresponding metalinguistic utterances and careful corrections, the will for regularity does not automatically lead to a norm. The best proof is provided by Konrad's epilogue, this time in the version of manuscript C, where the call for invariance returns in a varied form and is specified with regard to the conditions of a written culture. The term of the Vienna manuscript Buch has become a Latin model in C. The modality of the intervention is no longer sprechen, but tichten, composition. Incidentally, difficulties in enforcing linguistic regularity are not the privilege of the vernacular, right down to the level of orthography. Training as a scribe ensures comparative stability in the production of Latin writing. Peripheral areas in which variance spreads are also omnipresent in Latin, even if they are mostly limited in contrast to vernacular. In a bilingual parallel charter dated March 20th, 1289, from Central Bavaria, certain elements of the orthography vary in the Latin text. Classical T versus medieval C, while in the German text, the variance has an effect on the phonography as well on morphology. Chronologically, however, we are already at the end of the 13th century with this source, in the middle of the late Middle High German period, which we will deal with in detail in the next lecture.